More people were convicted of financial crimes and record penalties handed out by Singapore Central Bank from January 2022 to June of 2023. Now, that's compared with the previous 18-month period, according to the latest MAS enforcement report. Our reporter Heidi Young joins us right now to break down the numbers. Heidi, what's behind these high numbers that we're seeing for convictions and penalties?
That's right. If you take a look over there, we've got 39 people who were convicted of market misconduct and related offences in that 18-month period. Now, if you compare that to the previous 18-month period, it's actually higher than 7. And it's quite the big jump. But does it mean that people are out there committing more financial crime? Is financial crime more rampant nowadays? Not necessarily, because if you take a closer look at the report, the MAS did include some of the data from joint investigations with the police into this year's report, which could be the reason why we're seeing higher numbers this time around. If we've looked at the prohibition orders, we've got 18 prohibition orders, and these were handed out by the MAS to individuals that they had deemed unfit to be in the financial industry. One of them had even been banned for more than 10 years before he can try to re-enter that industry again. And if we take a look at the record total of $20.8 million in penalties, we've got close to 8 million in that financial penalties and compositions. And a bulk of that really was from the anti-money laundering breaches. So it really shows you that the government is taking this really seriously. And if we look at the 12.96 million, close to $13 million that was actually in civil penalties for market abuse cases. So these are your insider trading, your false trading, as well as disclosure-related breaches. One notable case would be the Noble Group case, where that commodity trader was fined by the MAS a record $12.6 million fine for their misleading financial statements because they had inflated some of their net assets and profits as well. And that was a 4-year-long investigation.
And not to mention that, the central bank has pointed out that, it's dealt with even more complex cases during this period. Can you just help us understand what's behind the complexities?
That's right. So the MAS is dealing with more complex financial crimes nowadays, but they're not necessarily taking 4 years with all of them. In fact, if you take a look, they are actually taking about 11 months on average for each of these cases for them to review and investigate the cases. That said, it is actually a slight increase from the previous report of 9 months. So it's actually a little bit slower. But does this mean, MAS officers are taking their sweet time solving these crimes? Not necessarily. It's because they say that, some of these cases happened during the COVID pandemic period. And that's when some cases, there were operational challenges in handling and investigating those cases. So that's why it took a bit longer. But yes, you mentioned these cases are getting more complex, and that's because of a lot more cross-border transactions. And when it's cross-border, they've got to knock on the doors of the other countries, seek help from other jurisdictions, get that information, get that data. And nowadays, our transactions, they're all increasingly digital as well. That means there's a lot more electronic documentation for our investigation officers to really sieve through and look through. So one analyst really thinks that a longer time period for cases to be resolved, that could be the norm going forward.
The complexity of cases, especially now with technological means, will become even harder to nail down the specificity of the problem. So the length of the time basically is reflective of the amount of information that would be needed to be digested, to be analyzed, such that we can get a good handle.
There are lots of threads to be unpicked when it comes to these investigations, Heidi. What will MAS be focusing on as their enforcement priorities going forward?
That's right. So the MAS has outlined 2 of their priorities going forward. And if you take a look, they said that they are going to be focusing on the digital asset ecosystem. These are your blockchains, your cryptocurrencies, things like your stable coin. They're also going to continue focusing on our asset and wealth managers, because they say that proper conduct from these asset and wealth managers are really vital to Singapore's role as a financial hub. So it's things like ensuring that they comply with anti-money laundering checks, for instance.
Beyond the digital token, I think the other space that we need to continue to look at is the traditional asset management space, where funds are moved from one place to another on the cues of investment. They could be in the form of wealth.
Heidi, money laundering cases have been in the spotlight, recently, and Singapore's anti-money laundering regime is sound, as we know. But what more do you think parties can do to dial up the scrutiny?
That's right. So I did speak to Prof. Low earlier, and he did say that there are other parties involved, and these are your 5 Cs. Now, not necessarily the 5 Cs that you and I may be familiar with as the ones that Singaporeans aspire for, but these are your cars, condos, country clubs, but you've also got your cryptos and your casinos. He says these are 5 Cs, and these are 5 areas that, bad money can be somehow transacted and turned into good money. So he says that players within these entire ecosystem and players along this entire chain need to be aware of suspicious transactions around them. And a system needs to be in place so that when they notice these kinds of suspicious transactions, there is an avenue for them to report it to the authorities and for the information to be shared across the 5 Cs so that the authorities can paint a fuller picture of what's behind these suspicious transactions and some possible motives behind them. Now, as you mentioned, that the big money laundering case that we're seeing in Singapore, $1.8 billion and growing. MES did say that the financial institutions involved, they actually did raise alarm bells and did raise some flags about certain suspicious transactions that they had witnessed. MES themselves also say that they did, some on their part of their surveillance did uncover some of these incidents. Just a recap on that case, 10 foreigners being charged in court this week on money laundering, forgery, as well as resisting arrest. And, plenty of curiosity around this case as well, with 43 parliamentary questions, filed on this on Monday. But the government did say that they will only be fully addressing all of this in a parliamentary sitting in October through a ministerial statement.
I will certainly be looking out for that. Thanks very much for coming into the studio today, Heidi Ng there.